They were attacked almost immediately. Mantids carrying long spears that skewered two of the first three men through the doorway and almost got Reeve as well. He barely parried in time and managed to get inside the mantid's guard. The mantid collapsed as his sword ran right through its thorax, and then the adrenaline surge was back, and the next alien was coming at him, and Reeve just slashed and stabbed and wove his way through them until suddenly there were no more mantids. No more live ones, at least. That, as it turned out, was the easy part. There were 3 tunnels branching out of the large entrance chamber, and more tunnels branching out of them. No sign of more mantids, but it was a big tower, and they had no way of knowing which way their target was. Steiner had no choice but to split them into squads now, and by the 3rd branch, Reeve had just 3 other guys with him. One of them he actually knew, by some miracle. Tom Wyatt had been in the same training facility as him. They'd spent a lot of time together and gotten to know each other pretty well. Wyatt was a former DJ, too. Displaced juvenile, that is. He'd lost both his parents during the attack on Chicago. A couple of weeks into training, he and Reeve had realized that they'd been through the same processing center in Ohio, and had even been at the same school for a few months, although Wyatt was a few years older, so they'd never spoken. The other 2 were Farkas and Yamada. He'd met Farkas before, but only in passing, and Yamada had gone through the training center in Seoul, and had probably never been in the same hemisphere as him. Farkas was from Europe and could at least speak English well, which was more than Yamada could, although from the way he handled his sword during their fight for the entrance, Reeve was happy to have him along anyway. The Japanese were one of the few nations that still had a tradition of swordsmanship, and they were always highly motivated. Almost every major Japanese city had been reduced to ruins by mantid raiding parties. Much of the material for this tower must have been harvested from Tokyo, Osaka, Sapporo, and so on. Through the faceplate of his helmet, Reeve could see a long scar running down Yamada's face, from his left eyebrow to the right corner of his lip, cutting across his nose. It looked old. Reeve almost asked if it was a souvenir from the mantids, but now wasn't the time. If they got out of this, maybe he'd buy him a drink later. The tunnels were made of the same pitch-black material as the tower's exterior, but the lighting was all a faint blue, matching the luminescence profile of the mantid's home star. Reeve led his squad along tunnel after tunnel, marking junctions on their map. They were still in radio contact with the rest of the company, but they'd lost any connection either to the army or the fleet, which wasn't a good sign. The tower might be blocking them, but it might also mean that the signal relays carried by the army had been captured. Deeper and deeper into the tower they went. Reeve had no strategy beyond pick the largest tunnel that led towards the center of the tower. Twice they came to dead ends. Real dead ends, as confirmed with a quick jab with their swords, and had to turn back. Reeve wondered if the architecture fitted some practical purpose that only mantids could understand, or whether it had just been deliberately designed to be confusing. 2 more times they came across patrols of armed mantids. The first one seemed to be looking for them. 10 mantids rushed out of a side tunnel and almost took Farkas's head off before Yamada neatly sliced through the first attacker from shoulder to hip, or rather from the arm joint to the segment where abdomen met thorax. The only thing that saved them from being brought down by weight of numbers was the narrowness of the tunnel. Reeve dispatched 3 himself, running the first one through and delivering a clumsy chop to the second one's abdomen, before recovering enough to neatly flick the last one's sword away by catching its barbs. He delivered the coup de grace by drawing his sword across its neck. The second patrol seemed even more surprised by the humans than the humans were by them. They only lasted a few seconds before Reeve and his squad were on their way again. And then they came across the unarmed mantids, and Reeve was faced with a quandary he'd never even thought of before. Every mantid he'd ever come across, everyone he'd ever heard of, had been carrying some kind of weapon. These 5 weren't wearing armor, they weren't armed, and from the way they were jerkily backing away it was obvious they were terrified. It was Wyatt who asked what they should do with them. From the way Yamada was advancing on them, he hadn't even thought it was a question, but Farkas was hesitating too. And it was Reeve who answered. They couldn't afford to let them give away their position. Seconds later, and 5 mantid bodies lay on the floor of the tunnel. Reeve couldn't help stopping to take a closer look. He'd never seen a mantid without their armor before, except for the autopsy photos in the intel briefings. They really did look like a praying mantis, at least at a glance. Not exactly, but close enough. 6 legs with 4 joints each. Their abdomen was fairly stubby and coiled upward rather than trailing along behind them, like some species of orchid mantis. They stood almost upright on 4 legs and had little claws on the tips. There were differences, though. Instead of the serrated forelimbs, they had thick arms that ended in delicately articulated claws that could grasp and manipulate. The way they were jointed and held against their bodies with the claws pointing down was very like a mantis. They had no feelers on antennae on their head, and their mouth parts opened to reveal a mouth like a sea anemone, with a ring of tentacles around a sphincter. The compound eyes on the side of their head didn't have stereoscopic vision. They relied on the 2 pairs in the middle of their head for that. They looked so much like a praying mantis from Earth that when they first started sending their raiding teams to the down from their ships, most people had assumed that there must be some relation. It was only years later, when humans finally managed to kill the first of them, that the dissection had proved that their internal structure didn't bear any resemblance. Even their cells were very different from Earth organisms, to the point where they didn't even have DNA. Evolution had selected for 6 legs, 3 segments, and an exoskeleton in 2 entirely different solar systems simply because it worked. Reeve had always wondered what they thought when they got to Earth, and found there were miniature versions of themselves stalking across the leaves and flower petals. Although they seemed so intent on harvesting the necessary resources to build this tower that it was entirely possible they never noticed. He'd also wondered that if humans looked more like a praying mantis, whether the aliens would have treated them any differently. The tunnels were definitely leading inward. Reeve still couldn't see any structural logic to them, but they were definitely heading towards the center. Some squads reported being bogged down by ever-increasing numbers of mantids, while others hadn't encountered any at all. Steiner was recalling some of them to reinforce those who were encountering the most resistance, on the basis the mantids were guarding them because they led to somewhere important. But he still wanted to explore as many routes as possible, so Reeve and his squad pressed on. The first moment Reeve knew they were under attack again was when something shot out of the darkness and splattered blood and other bits of Wyatt all over his shield. An arc rifle fired straight down the tunnel. They were lucky it had only killed one of them. Reeve pressed himself against the wall, then realized there was a side tunnel just ahead of them. He, Farkas, and Yamada reached it just as the arc rifle fired again. The shot passed so close it sent lines of energy rippling across Yamada's shield. Breathing heavily, Reeve took a moment to get a grip on himself. Then he took a peek down the tunnel. He was just able to see the shooter, maybe 20 meters ahead at the next junction. He jerked his head back quickly, expecting it to get shot off if he didn't. But of course the shooter wasn't going to waste another anti-field round until he had a clear shot. He looked down the side tunnel. It seemed to curve towards the center, too, but there was no telling how long a route it would take or what they would find down it. He took another peek towards the shooter. There was another side tunnel about 5 meters ahead on the opposite side. Someone might be able to make it if they were quick. Reeve quickly worked out a plan with his 2 remaining squad mates. Farkas and Yamada would see where the side tunnel led and try to flank the shooter, while Reeve kept the mantid's attention. Reeve gave them about 30 seconds, then took a running start and made a dash for the next side tunnel. Mantid reflexes were slower than humans, but not that slow. The anti-field round came so close to him that Reeve was sure it had hit him for a moment. He landed heavily in the next side tunnel and was surprised to find that he still had all his limbs. There was no way he'd get away with that again, but at least he was sure he had the shooter's attention. He peeked out once, twice, just to make sure the shooter was still there. In fact, it wasn't just the shooter, but at least 3 other mantids, hiding just behind the corner but not quite out of sight. A minute passed, then another. Then Farkas opened a comm line to tell him they'd hit a dead end and were heading back. Perfect. Reeve was almost hyperventilating now. He could feel they were close. But if the mantids at the other end of the tunnel chose to rush him, he wasn't sure he had the energy left to hold them all off. Fortunately, they didn't know that, or they just liked the position they were in. They had a ranged weapon and he didn't. The only way he was getting to the end of that corridor was if the mantid fired it. He could probably make it before the mantid reloaded. But of course, he wouldn't be able to do much good if he was in multiple pieces. Then he realized the solution. He told Farkas and Yamada, and they agreed. They would draw the mantid's fire, while he, being closer, would make a dash for the end of the corridor, while the shooter reloaded. It wasn't a great plan, but he'd made it, so there was a good chance that the others would too. As soon as Farkas and Yamada were in position, they went. First, Reeve threw a grenade. It wouldn't cause any injuries, but it might stun the enemy for a moment. When it went off, Farkas made a dash for the next side tunnel. The anti-field gun fired, and Reeve was up and running. There was no time to think about how many mantids he was running towards. He just had to trust he could stay alive long enough for Yamada and Farkas to catch up. They'd only be seconds behind him. 5 mantids, including the shooter who was now discarding his gun and drawing his arc saber. Reeve screamed, running on pure rage and adrenaline now. He didn't so much parry as beat down the first sword that came at him and impaled the owner right through the face. Then he punched the next enemy aside and body-checked another into the wall before sweeping round and slicing his sword down, causing the alien to collapse as its 2 right legs were cut clean through. He finished that one with a thrust through the thorax, then had to duck away as another sword narrowly missed decapitating him. 2 down, but he was tiring fast. He sprang up and tried to wrestle with the nearest one, figuring its friends would try to avoid hitting it, but that was easier said than done with their shields slipping and sliding off each other. He pushed it hard enough that it hit the wall, then disarmed one trying to stab him by hooking the barbs of the sword again. He felt more than saw the one on his left swing at his head and ducked down while swinging round blindly. Something connected, although he wasn't sure with what, but there wasn't a follow-up attack. He took the moment's respite to gut the mantid he'd disarmed, which had unwisely dived forward to retrieve its sword. Then the mantid he'd pushed into the wall repaid the favor and slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. His sword went spinning away, and suddenly Reeve found himself on the ground, looking up at a mantid that had its sword raised, ready to strike. He tried to get up, but he had nothing left. The exhaustion was like barbed hooks digging into him, pulling him down to the floor. The mantid brought its sword down, only to find that its arm had been severed at the joint by Yamada, who stepped past Reeve and neatly decapitated the mantid. Yamada held out his arm and helped Reeve to his feet. Reeve didn't even have to ask about Farkas. The way Yamada continued on down the tunnel told him that it was just the 2 of them now. Pity. Reeve had met the Hungarian at an airbase in southern England just before they made the trip up into orbit. They'd only exchanged a few words while they were waiting for their assignments, but he'd have liked to get to know him better. He'd had that thought too many times in his life. From today, no more. Reeve knew he probably wasn't making it out of this, but if he did, he'd be going back to a world where you didn't wonder how long a friendship would last before the mantids cut it short.